Greetings. Today I want to talk about some Underground Railroad sites of southeastern Indiana. I will use the historical markers located around the region as a reference point. My book, Southeast Indiana Day Trips from my Road Trip Indiana series, includes every historical marker installed by the Indiana Historical Bureau in the region. In the book, I include the text of the marker as well as some background information to give the marker more context. Historical markers are ignored by many. However, they can give some interesting insights into the events, people, and places of a city, town, or village. Many of the topics of the markers are not well known. First, I will give you a short history of the Underground Railroad movement. The Underground Railroad was a vast network of people in the North and South who aided fugitive slaves in their flight from slavery. In Indiana, the route stretched from communities along the Ohio River to the Michigan border. From Michigan, the fugitives fled north to Canada and freedom. Forefront in this movement were groups like the American Colonization Society and the Quakers. Many of these groups used agents to go south to the Ohio River to aid slaves wishing to free. The route escaping slaves took when fleeing bondage was never a static route. It changed constantly due to many factors. Slaves escaping bondage from the south faced many obstacles. Most slaves were kept illiterate by their owners, so they could not read or write. Thus, newspapers, maps, and other written media were useless to them. Their knowledge of the surrounding countryside was limited. Thus, once they were out of their immediate area, they could not know who to trust. Slaves along the Ohio River often used it as an avenue of escape. Before the United States Corps of Engineers built a dam and lock system along the river, water levels were much lower. In winter, the river commonly froze over. Slaves living in northern Kentucky often just walked across the ice to Indiana. There are some tales of escaping slaves rowing boats across the river. Legend holds that slaveholders in northern Kentucky moved their slaves south in winter to get them away from the river. Free blacks lived mostly in separate communities in Indiana as well as other free states. There were communities of free blacks in Madison, Evansville, and other river towns. Frequently, escaping slaves sought out these communities as they would blend in better there than in a white community. Many free blacks were willing to help them. From this haven, they could plan their move away from the United States and into Canada. Various people in this clandestine network acquired names that belied their role. People that guided the refugees along the way and provided them with refuge at great personal risk were called conductors. The homes and businesses used to harbor the refugees became known as stations. The conductors referred to the refugees as passengers. Frequently, free blacks traveled into the South, a dangerous enterprise, to find those that wished to escape, and guided them north. These free blacks were called pilots. Bounty hunters sought out the escapees on their journey north to capture them and return them to their owners. The conductors did not keep records of their activities, as these would be incriminating, and if the authorities found them, they could use them to convict the conductors and send them to prison. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 changed a number of things about this Underground Railroad and how it operated. This act reinforced the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. The act made aiding and abetting escaping slaves a crime and placed fines on those that defied it. Slave hunters or bounty hunters had only posters and flyers to use in their search. The act authorized federal marshals to capture blacks, and it allowed local law enforcement in free states to assist them. Private citizens were also allowed to capture escaping slaves for the reward. These people became known as bounty hunters. A bounty hunter with only an obscure affidavit could capture escaping blacks and return them to their owners. Bounty hunters roamed the free northern states searching for escaped blacks and presented an additional peril to the refugees. Congress repealed this law in 1864 during the ravages of the Civil War. The Underground Railroad network expanded after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. Many Northerners felt that the federal government had overstepped its boundaries by interfering with their opposition to slavery. Many historians estimate that over 100,000 slaves escaped bondage using this obscure network that stretched northward from the Ohio River to Canada. The network changed constantly as conductors many times either died or sold their homes, which necessitated a change. These changes could occur quickly, so a working knowledge of the active conductors was necessary. The route could change due to bounty hunter activity, unavailability of a conductor, or other reasons. Movement occurred mostly at night and at random patterns. An escapee might move north, then east, then west, and finally north again, depending on the different circumstances. Eventually, if all went well, the escaping slaves reached Canada, which provided a safe haven. First off, this podcast will skip over some of the Underground Railroad's markers mentioned in previous podcasts. The first one on our tour of references is a lady named Hannah Tolliver. This one is located at the corner of Pearl Street and Riverside Drive in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Marker text, Side 1, Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, did not free slaves in Kentucky. In April 1864, Hannah Tolliver, a free black woman living in Jeffersonville, was arrested for aiding a fugitive slave in Kentucky. In May, she was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in a Kentucky penitentiary. She was pardoned January the 5th, 1865, and returned to Jeffersonville. Side 2, Tolliver and other blacks risked their freedoms aiding fugitives. Slavery in the U.S. abolished in December of 1865. In the 19th century, who aided slaves escaping to freedom in the southern United States. I have expanded on this a little bit more. Hannah Tolliver was part of a network of free blacks and whites that risked their lives and freedoms by helping fugitive slaves escape bondage. Forefront in this movement were groups like the American Colonization Society and the Quakers. Many of these groups used agents to go south of the Old River to aid slaves wishing to free. Hannah was performing this service in Kentucky when arrested for, quote, enticing a slave, unquote. Kentucky at the beginning of the Civil War was a tenuous situation. It was a slave state with strong Southern ties. It was also a Unionist state that believed strongly in the Constitution. Its leaders realized that, as it was geographically an important strategic location, much of the fighting would occur there. Both sides would need to send armies through Kentucky to get to their opponents. Kentucky officials tried to minimize the damage to their state by not taking sides. Early in 1861, they declared neutrality. They would contribute neither troops nor aid to either side. It was a policy doomed to fail. Much of the early fighting did take place there, killing many Kentuckians and destroying much property. President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January the 1st, 1863. The proclamation was limited in what it did. It only freed slaves in states deemed in rebellion. In addition, it only freed states still in Confederate territory. It did not free slaves in areas under control of the Union Army, nor did it free slaves in neutral states like Kentucky. Lincoln did not believe he was constitutionally entitled to free all the slaves. He believed that only Congress could do that through legislation or amending the Constitution. Thus, slaves remained slaves in the neutral states until the 13th Amendment banned it. Hannah Tolliver was a free black that lived in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Kentucky officials arrested Hannah Tolliver in April 1864 as she was helping a slave named William Murphy escape. Since it was against Kentucky law to assist escaping slaves, they tried and convicted her. She was sentenced to 7 years in jail. Kentucky Governor Thomas Bramlett pardoned her on January the 5th, 1865, after Congress passed the 13th Amendment in January 1865. She returned to Jeffersonville. The next one we will visit is going to be in Lancaster in Jefferson County to find a marker honoring Lyman Hoyt at 7147 West State Road 250, Lancaster in Jefferson County. Marker text, Side 1, born in Vermont, 1804. Moved to Jefferson County, 1834, where he owned land and had several manufacturing businesses. Active in Neals Creek Anti-Slavery Society and in forming Liberty Party for abolition of slavery. He and his family supported the Lutheran College. He died in 1857, home listed in the National Register of Historic Places, 2003. Side 2, Hoyt condemned the fugitive slave law and participated in helping fugitive slaves escape through Jefferson County. We expanded on this a little bit more by writing a brief biography of Lyman Hoyt, who lived from 1804 until 1857. Native Vermonters, Lyman Hoyt and his family, Asinatha Whipple Hoyt, moved from Vermont to Lancaster, Indiana around 1839. Asinatha's sister lived in the community, which had strong abolitionist ties, and had suggested that her sister and brother-in-law move there to help them with the movement. Their activity exposed them to discovery by slave bounty hunters that followed reports of escaped slaves north in an effort to capture them and return them to their masters. Dennis Hillis and William McFarland platted Lancaster, Indiana on April the 5th, 1815, with 128 lots, with one reserved for a courthouse. Madison was the county seat at the time, and the men hoped to attract it away from that river community. About 10 miles north of Madison, the small town attracted mostly anti-slave New England Baptists and soon became a hotbed of the Underground Railroad activity. Lyman Hoyt was a conductor in a network of free blacks and whites that risked their lives and freedoms helping the fugitive slaves escape bondage. As a conductor, Lyman took escaping slaves from one point on the railroad's route to another, always taking them further north and away from slavery. Before the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, all United States citizens, even in the free states of the North, were required to return escaped slaves. Anyone caught aiding a slave faced stiff fines for doing so. After a slave escaped, their owner would make great efforts to regain them. Before the Fugitive Slave Act, these efforts were mainly printing and distributing flyers, putting up posters, and taking out newspaper ads. The Fugitive Slave Act strengthened the law against helping those slaves escape, and gave the owners the right to send bounty hunters into the North in an attempt to recapture them. Anyone caught aiding a fugitive slave was subject to much stiffer fines and penalties than before the act. Participants in the Underground Railroad were always in danger of the penalties. Hoyt and some local Lancaster residents formed the Neels Creek Anti-Slavery Society in 1839. Thus organized, they formed an integral link in the Underground Railroad. Lyman transported slaves in his wagons, hid them from slave catchers in his barn and in a cave on his property. He fed them and gave them clothing. The members of the Neels Creek Anti-Slavery Society established an abolitionist church called Neels Creek Anti-Slavery Baptist Church in 1846, after the society disbanded in 1845. The church had many of the same members as the society had. Hoyt wrote articles for Cincinnati abolitionist newspaper, The Philanthropist, and helped other abolitionists like Thomas Craven. Craven and Hoyt were also instrumental in establishing Eleutherian College. Part of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, the Hoyt House belongs to the historic Eleutherian College located in Lancaster. It is not open to the public. After Hoyt died in 1857, Asenath reduced her activities in the movement. Near this marker is one noting the location of the Eleutherian College at 6927 West State Route 250, Lancaster. Marker text, Side 1, College developed 1854 from Eleutherian Institute, founded in 1848. Thomas Craven and anti-slavery advocates in the area created and supported the institution for education of students of all races and genders. The structure, built in the 1850s for classes and a chapel, was purchased for the restoration in 1990, designated National Historic Landmark in 1997. Side 2, Eleutherian provided one of the earliest educational opportunities for women and African Americans before the Civil War. I've written a little bit more about the Eleutherian College. Founded by Thomas Craven in 1848, Eleutherian College became the first black school in Indiana that accepted any student regardless of race or gender. Thomas Craven lived from March the 19th, 1792 until August the 21st, 1860. A native of Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, Thomas's parents were blacksmith Thomas Craven and Emergy Isbrants. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it's a strange name. Anyway, the elder Craven served in the Revolutionary War. As a young man, the younger Thomas migrated to Indiana in 1812 after floating down the Ohio River in a flatboat and arriving at Cincinnati. He went to Franklin County to live. He served as a captain during the War of 1812, serving in a blockhouse in Indiana. He moved into Ohio in 1826 and at the age of 45 entered Miami University. He achieved his lifelong dream of a college education in 1842. In 1848, he donated land in Lancaster, Indiana, Jefferson County, to the Eleutherian College. He engaged in several fundraising trips later on to raise money for this institution. Thomas passed away in 1860 and is interred in College Hill Cemetery in Lancaster. The Eleutherian College was founded by members of Neels Creek Abolitionist Baptist Church with substantial help from Thomas Craven and Lyman Hoyt. The college opened in 1848. The word Eleutherian derives from the Greek word eleutheros. That word means freedom and equality. In 1857, this college enrolled 18 black students, 10 of whom were former slaves. By 1850, the enrollment increased to 200, 50 of which were former slaves, were blacks. Anyway, when the public school for free blacks opened, the school closed. Purchased by the Lancaster Township in 1888, the township operated it as a public school until 1938. The building still stands in Lancaster. It is part of the National Underground Railroad network to freedom. Free blacks settled in many towns along the Ohio River. Georgetown, on the north side of Madison, was one of these settlements, marked by an historical marker at Jefferson and Fifth Streets in Madison. Marker text, Side 1. Free blacks settled in Madison as early as 1820. The growing black community began businesses and organized churches and schools in this area, later called Georgetown. Risking their own freedom, some free black residents here actively aided slaves seeking freedom. A few of these residents had to flee from Madison themselves in the late 1840s. Side 2. Despite the danger, after the late 1840s, some free blacks in Madison continued to aid freedom seekers. I have written a little bit more of a brief history of Georgetown. Free blacks settled in Madison, forming the neighborhood known as Georgetown. The origin of the name is unknown, is lost to the mists of history, but legend attributes it to residents of George Short or George Hopkins. The neighborhood ranges along North Walnut Street from Main Street to Side 1. The Tibbets assisted fugitive slaves here in their home, now part of National Park Service network to freedom. John piloted them to the next safe haven. Both were members of Neal's Creek Anti-Slavery Society and Anti-Slavery Regular Baptist Church at College Hill. John served as a trustee for the church and the Lutheran College. Side 2. Free blacks from Madison and the surrounding area and white abolitionists helped fugitive slaves. And it goes on to just repeat what I've read about the Underground Railroad on some of the other markers. John H. Tibbets lived from June the 27th, 1818 until, well, they don't know when he passed away. At any rate, he was a native of Claremont County, Ohio. John came from a strong anti-slavery family. At age 16, he became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. His older brother, Dr. Samuel Tibbets, and his wife, Susanna Combs Tibbets, had moved to Jefferson County in 1830. Around the year 1843, John moved to Lancaster, Indiana, in Jefferson County. While there, he became acquainted with Sarah Ann Nelson, niece of HOYT LYMAN. Sarah Ann Nelson lived from 1820, and again, they don't know when she passed away. Her father was a soldier and held claim to land in Jefferson County. Her parents, James and Lucy Nelson, moved there around 1820 and settled near Lancaster. The idea for Neal's Creek Anti-Slavery Society originated in James Nelson's home. Sarah and John married on September the 22nd, 1844. The familial relationship that existed between the main organizers of the group provided security against betrayal for the group's Underground Railroad activities. Together, working with other members of the group, it is likely that they moved hundreds of escaping slaves from bondage to freedom. From Madison, we move upriver to Rising Sun, Indiana, to note the achievements of the Barkshire family. The marker is located at 201 North Poplar Street in Rising Sun. Text Side 1. African-American Samuel Barkshire was freed from slavery in Boone County, Kentucky in 1833. He and his family moved here in 1836. The Barkshires defied fugitive slave laws to provide aid and comfort to those escaping bondage in the South. Their Rising Sun home, just north of the Ohio River, became an important hub for connecting freedom seekers to the routes of escape. Side 2. The Barkshires faced threats of violence and re-enslavement by slave hunters, yet they persisted. Some prominent abolitionists and local residents assisted the family's Underground Railroad activity. One ally was Nancy Hawkins, who had formerly held the Barkshires in slavery in Kentucky, relocated along with them in 1836, and then aided African-American freedom seekers. I've expanded on this actually by quite a bit. Samuel Barkshire lived from about 1798 until April the 11th, 1875. Born about 1798 as a slave to Dickey Barkshire in Harrison County, Kentucky. After Dickey's death, his son Felix acquired him. Felix sold him to Joseph Hawkins, who manumitted Samuel in 1833 for the sum of $1. Samuel married Frances Newman, who was owned by Hawkins. The couple would have 6 children. Barkshire purchased 100 acres of land next to Hawkins only 3 months after Hawkins manumitted him, a monumental accomplishment. Most manumitted slaves were elderly and well past their prime working years. Samuel was still young and stayed in the area, which was also unusual for a young freed slave. By staying in a slave street, he risked by staying in a slave state, he risked kidnapping and return to his status as a slave. Any time a slave escaped, the white neighbors in the area would immediately cast eyes on free blacks living nearby, viewing them as accomplices in the escape. By staying in the area, he risked many things. Before moving to Rising Sun, Samuel had possibly been engaged in helping escaped slaves in their quest to find freedom while still living in Kentucky. The land he had purchased there bordered the Ohio River and provided a good conduit for slaves fleeing north. This was extremely dangerous for Berkshire, as if caught, he was subject to severe punishment. Sometime before 1840, the Berkshire family moved across the Ohio River to settle in Rising Sun, Indiana. Berkshire worked as a cooper's trade in Rising Sun, making many of the barrels used to ship goods on the river and to age whiskey at the numerous distilleries that lined the river. He also continued his work in the Underground Railroad, serving as a contact person. He and his family hid escaping slaves and passed along bits of valuable information. Berkshire's wife and children were also intimately involved in the movement, as was Samuel's former owner, Nancy Hawkins. After his death, Samuel was interred at Union Cemetery in Rising Sun. Nancy Hawkins lived from 1776 until 1854. History knows little of Nancy Hawkins before marriage to Joseph Hawkins around 1817. She was native to Virginia. She may have been married to, or at least the common law wife of, Dickie Berkshire, though the only evidence linking them is circumstantial. If so, she would possibly have known Samuel prior to his transfer to Hawkins while he was enslaved by Berkshire. Sometime after John's death in 1836, she moved across the Ohio River to Rising Sun, close to the same time as Samuel Berkshire and his family. Sometime after the move to Rising Sun, Nancy filed papers that officially manumitted Samuel's wife and children, as well as other slaves she had brought to Rising Sun. Since there was danger that manumitted slaves could be kidnapped and returned and sold back into slavery, which often happened, Nancy ensured that their protections were filed prior to their manumission. The Berkshire family included Arthur Berkshire, Emily, Garrett, Matilda, Minerva, and Woodford. Arthur Berkshire lived from 1825 until June the 25th, 1864. The son of Samuel Berkshire and Frances Harriet Newman, Arthur was native to Boone County, Kentucky. During his early life, he lived as a slave owned by Dickie Berkshire and later Joseph and Nancy Hawkins in 1836. Nancy Hawkins manumitted him in 1848 after she moved to Rising Sun in Indiana. Arthur, as well as his other siblings, became involved in the Underground Railroad movement as a conductor. He and Elizabeth Couth married on June the 18th, 1854. Elizabeth lived in Ohio. When Arthur brought his new bride to Rising Sun, he violated Article 13 of the Constitution that Indiana had adopted in 1851. The provisions of this article are stated below. Section 1. No Negro or mulatto shall come into or settle in the state after the adoption of this Constitution. Section 2. All Negroes all contracts made by any Negro or mulatto coming into the state, contrary to the provisions of the foregoing section, shall be void, and any person who shall employ such Negro or mulatto, otherwise encourage him to remain in the state, shall be fined in any sum not less than $10 nor more than $500. Section 3. All fines which may be collected for a violation of the provisions of this article, or of any law which hereafter may be passed for the purpose of carrying the same into execution, shall be set apart and appropriated for the colonization of such Negroes and mulattoes and their descendants as may be in the state at the adoption of this Constitution and may be willing to immigrate. Section 4. The General Assembly shall pass laws to carry out the provisions of this article. Thus, Berkshire and Elizabeth had to leave Indiana. They migrated back to her home state of Ohio. Berkshire enlisted in the 27th United States Colored Infantry Regiment when it organized in Delaware, Ohio on January the 16th, 1864. Berkshire would die of disease on June the 25th, 1864. Garrett Berkshire lived from October the 31st, 1826 until May the 11th, 1894. The son of Samuel Barkshire and Frances Harriet Newman, Garrett was native to Boone County, Kentucky. During his early life, he lived as a slave owned by Dickie Barkshire and later Joseph and Nancy Hawkins, beginning in 1836. Nancy Hawkins manumitted him in 1848 after he moved to Rising Sun in Indiana. Garrett would marry twice, to Sarah Ellis and to Frances Kennedy. He had one child. Garrett acted as a conductor in the Underground Railroad system. His job working on riverboats allowed him to travel to Orleans, Louisiana. There he collected slaves wanting freedom and took them north to Rising Sun, where they used a network of stations that took them north to freedom. Garrett died in Terre Haute, Indiana, as is interred in Highland Lawn Cemetery there. Matilda Berkshire lived from July the 19th, 1828, through November the 17th, 1892. The daughter of Samuel Berkshire and Frances Harriet Newman, Matilda was native to Boone County, Kentucky. During her early life, she lived as a slave owned by Dickie Barkshire and later Joseph and Nancy Hawkins, beginning in 1836. Nancy Hawkins manumitted her in 1848, along with her siblings, after she moved to Rising Sun in Indiana. There is no documentation of the daughters' participation in the Underground Railroad activities of their parents. However, their presence in the home allows speculation that somehow she was involved. She married George W. Kennedy on October the 21st, 1851, and later Willis Wade on December the 10th, 1871. She had 2 children. She passed away in Terre Haute and is interred there. Minerva Berkshire was born on September the 15th, 1836, and passed away on January the 11th, 1908. The daughter of Samuel Berkshire and Frances Harriet Newman, Minerva was native to Boone County, Kentucky, and like her siblings, she spent her early life as a slave owned by Dickie Berkshire and later Joseph and Nancy Hawkins. Nancy Hawkins manumitted her along with her siblings in 1848, and she and Noah B. Tutton married on November the 4th, 1854. The family migrated to Muscatine, Iowa. After her death, Minerva was interred in Greenwood Cemetery in Muscatine. Woodford Berkshire, who was also the son of Frances and Harriet, and his story is similar until he became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping his parents in their task of aiding escaped slaves seeking freedom in Canada. The couple would have 3 children. Woodford was interred in Union Cemetery in Rising Sun after his death. Moving north to Ripley County, we travel back roads to Flat Rock to find a marker noting the location of the Union Church at 6303 County Road 975 West and Flat Rock Road. Marker text, Side 1, August the 12th, 1843, Union Church organizes a Free Will Baptist Church at the home of Harvey Marshall. Church covenant states, quote, "We cannot receive slaveholders into the church, nor those who believe that slavery is right," unquote. First church building completed in 1859 near here. In 1914, members changed denomination and the name of the church. New church was built here in 1921. Side 2. Strong anti-slavery stance of Free Will Baptist churches contributed to end slavery and freedom. I have written just a little bit more about the church, which is located on West Flat Rock Road, southwest of Napoleon, Indiana. To get to the church from Napoleon, which is on US 41, south of Greensburg and north of Versailles, Indiana, travel west on Millhausen Road about 1.1 miles, turn left on Brownstown Road and drive about 4 miles to County Road 900 West. Turn left on 900 West and drive about 1 mile to Flat Rock Road. Turn right on Flat Rock Road. The Union Church is in a peaceful valley less than a half mile from the intersection of Flat Rock Road and 900 West. The remote location of this stop on the Underground Railroad route made it one of the few places escaping slaves could worship in public. There were slave catchers living in the area, but before the sheriff or federal marshals could arrive to arrest the slaves, someone in the Ripley County Courthouse had warned the conductors and they could hide the slaves away before they could arrive to get the runaways. Mentioned on the marker to the Lutheran College as the founder of the institution, James Harrison Craven home is located at 324 East Fairground Road in Osgood. Marker text, Side 1, born in 1802 as in Virginia, admitted to the bar in 1823, moved to Jefferson County, Indiana, 1829, established the law office in Versailles, Ripley County in 1833, served 4 terms in the Indiana General Assembly, elected as a Whig to U.S. Congress, 1841, lost as Free Soil candidate, Indiana governor in 1849, and as Republican candidate for Attorney General in 1856. Side 2. A well-known debater, he opposed the extension of slavery, 1850 Slavery Act, requiring citizens to return escaping slaves to their owners, and Article 13 of the 1850 Constitution, prohibiting blacks from moving in Indiana. Served briefly in the Civil War. Moved to Osgood area before 1860. Built home here 1865. Died at Osgood December the 4th, 1876. James Harrison Craven lives from August the 2nd, 1802 until December the 4th, 1876. A native of Harrisburg, Rockingham County, Virginia, Craven studied law, received admittance to the bar in 1823, and opened a practice in Harrisonburg. In 1829, he migrated to Madison, Indiana, and became involved in agriculture. Cravens gained election to the Indiana House of Representatives. He served in the House from 1831 and through 1833. In 1833, he moved to Ripley County, Indiana, and opened a law practice in Versailles. After winning a term to the Indiana State Senate in 1841, he mounted a successful campaign for the United States House of Representatives. He ran for Indiana governor in 1852 as a Free Soil candidate. During the Civil War, he joined the 83rd Regiment Indiana Volunteer Infantry and served as a lieutenant colonel. General John Hunt Morgan's troops captured his troop during the raid Indiana, and he remained a prisoner of war until the conflict ended. After mustering out of the Army, Cravens moved back to Ripley County, building a home in Osgood. He lived in that house until his death in 1876. During his time in office, he opposed Article 13 of the Indiana Constitution. The Free Soil Party originated in Buffalo, New York. It appealed mainly to people in upstate New York, western Massachusetts, Ohio, and Indiana. The short-lived party remained active for two presidential elections, 1848 and 1852. Its candidates, Martin Van Buren and John P. Hale, were unsuccessful. The party consisted mainly of anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats. They opposed expanding slavery into the territories and tried to expunge laws in the state that discriminated against free blacks. After the 1852 support for the Free Soil Party disintegrated, many of the former adherents established the Republican Party, which successfully ran Abraham Lincoln for president in 1860. The home of another leader in the Underground Railroad movement, Stephen S. Harding, is located at Washington and Tyson Streets, southwest corner of the Courthouse Square in Versailles, Indiana. Marker text, Side 1. Born in 1808, Ontario County, New York, moved with family to Ripley County in 1820. Prominent abolitionist and orator, delivering powerful anti-slavery speeches throughout the area, often against public sentiment. Was active in Liberty Party and Republican Party. Received several appointments from President Abraham Lincoln. Died February the 12th, 1891. Side 2. Harding was an early leader in the opposition to slavery, helping to bring freedom to people enslaved in the United States. Stephen S. Harding lived from February the 28th, 1808 until February the 12th, 1891. The oldest son of David and Abigail Harding, Stephen was born in Palermo, New York. The family moved to Ripley County in 1820 when he was 12. He studied law in Brookville, Indiana, and opened an office in Richmond, Indiana. He moved back to Versailles after a few months and opened an office there around 1828. In that year, he traveled to New Orleans on business. While in New Orleans, he saw a slave market and visited a plantation. After seeing the plight of the slaves, he became fiercely anti-slavery. Upon his return to Versailles, he started speaking about abolition in an area that had been settled primarily by people from the South and who were sympathetic to slavery. In spite of his friends' warnings about his safety, Harding continued to speak out against the institution, believing if he could describe it, he could change people's minds. He traveled around the country on speaking engagements. Gradually, the sentiment changed to become anti-slavery. The Underground Railroad movement grew. There were 5 routes through Ripley County for slaves to escape. He became a supporter of Abraham Lincoln, who rewarded him with 2 positions. The first, the governor of Utah, ended when he questioned Mormon practice of polygamy, and they asked to have him removed. Lincoln then appointed him as Chief Justice of the Colorado Territorial Court. He served in several other government posts before retiring to Milan, Indiana. After his death, his body was interred in Greendale Cemetery in Greendale, Indiana. Find out about these and more Find out more about these Indiana day trip destinations and many more by purchasing the book Southeast Indiana Day Trips. The book includes contact information for all, has location information for all these markers, as well as information on state parks, nature preserves, golf courses, wineries, breweries, and much, much more. You can find it on my website, www.mossyfeetbooks, on the Road Trip Indiana category. Just scroll down to the categories, click Road Trip Indiana series. There are links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google Play, and other online book retailers. You may choose to purchase the book in ebook or softbound versions. An audiobook version is also available on Google Play. There will be 4 more podcasts of this series covering some of the historical markers, courthouses, and Underground Railroad sites. Well, I'll make that 3 more because we're already doing the one on Indiana, the Underground Railroad. At the conclusion of the series, I will combine all of these episodes into an audiobook. The next series will cover Indiana's role in the Civil War. Listeners may be interested in my book, The Ultimate Day Trip Travel Guide. The 747-page book includes a plethora of day trip destinations in Indiana. A complete tourism guide, the book includes local and state parks, museums, golf courses, and much, much more. The book includes information on all of Indiana's 92 counties. No traveler in Indiana should be without it. You can also order these books direct from me, the author, on the webpage. If you wish me to sign the book, you send an email to mossyfeetbooks@gmail.com requesting a signed book and instructions on how you want me to address it. Note, if you send me an email, I will add you to my contact list. Readers on the list will receive an email from me announcing when I publish a new book. If you do not want to add me to the list, tell me and I will not do so. Listeners to this podcast that want email notification of my new releases can just send me an email requesting addition to the list. You can choose to have your name removed at any time. If you browse the website, you will find dozens of sample chapters, one for each of my books. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and thank you for listening.